HR professional or the DEI practitioner still does their job. To me, the HR professional is a process owner. So I look at it as the North Star.
Okay.
So executives determine where we're going, and then you might have a council that determines how we get there. And then you have HR as process owners to say how it gets embedded into our processes. Yes. And so I believe everybody plays a role. And the executive team, once they've established the vision, their job is to talk about it and hold people accountable.
Yep. Welcome to Onyx Rising's conversation series, Dialogues with the Doctor, where leadership meets inclusion, one conversation at a time. As always, we are here to educate, engage, and inspire professionals to create inclusive, forward-thinking environments. I'm your host, Dr. B, and welcome to today's conversation. Welcome back to Dialogues with the Doctor. I'm Dr. B, and we have
Kelly Lester with Onyx Rising.
And today's topic, we are talking about valuing diversity, equity, and inclusion. So if you don't mind, we'll go ahead and hop right into our conversation today.
Sounds good.
So can you talk about what is the value of DEI today and the value to organizations and individuals on both ends?
Yeah, and it's interesting you even put the question that way, Brandy, because ultimately people forget about the with them for the individual. Many times organizations it's easy to talk about the value, right? So at the organizational level, typically most business cases, if you will, is all about talent. Right. That's the common thread I hear across all of my organizations is how do we attract the best talent from all backgrounds? How do we develop and retain that talent? And then empower that talent to give us great ideas for innovation. So usually talent is a big component. If you're B2C, think of McDonald's, right? McDonald's makes predominantly hamburgers, and they want to sell those hamburgers to a broad array of people. So you really are looking at the business case being connected to diversifying your consumer base or your client base or getting into new markets. So how do we understand what they need? How do we know how to speak to them? How do we understand their buying trends and their approach? For example, one of my clients, when they think about their audience generationally, they were thinking, well, we still need to go out and sell face to face. Well, no. A lot of people from a different generation, your generation in particular, are very much okay with buying products online. And so are we even having accessibility that way? Or are we still doing the same things in the same way? So typically those are two big ones, right? Talent, your customer base. Other things might be your culture. So how do we get to innovation? And that is laying the groundwork as a leader, right? So what kind of culture are we creating? How are we empowering people to be in that culture? We spend more time at work, right, than any place else. Let it be a place that truly values me.
Absolutely.
So if I'm going into work every day, I'm choosing this culture over another. One of my clients talked about, I told them, I said, you have an amazing value proposition. You predominantly hire lawyers, but in your particular culture, people articulated that you're not cutthroat like the other law firms. You care about us as a person. And so that is a huge advantage, if you will, a competitive advantage among others. So those are some of the elements, but I always encourage clients, as you know, to look at what is their unique value proposition, not the same thing for someone else, but how do you say that in your own words? And like that particular client did, they said, I love the teaching and learning culture here, and I love that I'm not a number and it's not cutthroat. Those are like speaking points unique to that organization. So when you attach this topic of DEI, inclusive innovation, inclusive leadership, when you think whatever you're branding it, right, think about it relative to that buy-in organizationally. It will help us increase profit. The other thing to think about is there's a diversity outcome and then there's a business outcome. And so a lot of times human resources professionals, DEI practitioners will talk about it and say, oh, we'll have diverse talent, but you have to speak business outcome. What is that going to gain us? Right? The diverse array of talent will help us have better ideas. For individuals, I think I'm going to actually put that one back on you, because I'll say, I think it's unique to each of us. Really, it is. For me, I personally like to work in an environment where I'm, not other smart people are there. I'm not the only one with the answers, and people that are empowered to bring those answers to bear, and contribute and see value in it. So I think that's the individual. I want to learn from others.
Yeah, same.
I don't know what would you say?
I would say the same. I think for me, being in a space where I can learn from others, I've always been taught, like, don't go into a room thinking you're the smartest person in the room, right? Like, I don't care what kind of degrees you have, what kind of skills, but there's always going to be something you don't know. So being able to go into that space and learn things from other people. But I think one of the things that you said early on in your comments that stood out to me was accessibility. When it comes to diversity, equity, inclusion, most folks think race, ethnicity off the top, but there's so many other things, right? Like diversity of thought, accessibility, whether you are doing a Zoom webinar or something and you have subtitles at the bottom or things like that. So things that people don't necessarily often think of. I'm the one in the room and saying, well, have we thought about this related to this consumer or this audience? And so for me, I think valuing DEI is at the core of what I believe, because otherwise, how do we empower these folks to do their job? Just how that last conversation we just had, so.
And I think the organizations have to think about the retention, right? Yeah. So if we are spending all this money to attract and develop and so forth, once do you want to keep doing that over and over again? So the culture really becomes, as I think someone said, there's a quote like culture
eats strategy every day, all day. Absolutely.
So it doesn't even matter as we're setting goals for the year, for 2025, right? Like, what is the plan here? Right? Like, and how will we make that happen? And what will get in the way? And culture will get in the way
every time. Every time. Thanks for bringing that up, because when you had talked about culture, and I was going to bring up the quote of culture eats strategy, and it does, because if folks don't want to come into the workplace, then your business solutions aren't going to necessarily be met at the end of the year.
That's true.
Just because of the type of culture that you have.
Yeah, or you're limited.
Or you're limited, right? Yeah.
So if we keep trying to attack the same problem with the same old school, strategy, I mean, you're only going to win with limited, rise.
Yeah.
So,
absolutely. So how does Onyx Rising help organizations establish or confirm the value in DEI?
Fun time. So I've learned a lot over the course of years. I used to think there was only one way to do strategy, but I learned from my clients, which is really nice, right? It's like we practice what we preach, right? Like, we're listening what will work here. And, but one of the things that I would say, our standard approach, which we adapt by understanding the organization's culture and how they deal with either culture change or change management. But our biggest approach is to do interviews with the executives. I feel like when it comes to this topic, we try to treat it differently than other business imperatives. But because I look at this as a business imperative, I strongly start at the top of the house and try to interview executives so that their voice is in it. And yes, you could have and understand the reasons for the case for change, right? The business case. But if you don't have executive buy-in and their voice in where are we going, what does this mean uniquely to us, then I think you will have less people on board. and leaders won't embrace it and advocate for it because it's somebody else's thing. It becomes HR's thing or DEI practitioner's thing, and they don't own it. Similar to some people's strategies, right? So they have to have their voice in it. We typically schedule interviews, interview them, ask them a set of questions. Some of those questions, I won't give all of them, is if we get this right, what would it look like, right? How do you define this topic? And then why is it important? And so ultimately we get at the why is it important? And then as we say, how will this help the business strategy? So I always ask about what are your business strategy goals or your mission? How do you now see this topic supporting it? And ultimately the answers to that really help to give the vision. And so we work back and forth then to massage it to be sure that it looks and sounds like that organization's culture and in their voice and in their words.
Okay, so when you take this to the executives, like what is their initial reaction? Because a lot of times when we take DEI work to the executives, it's more so, oh, that's not our job, or we necessarily haven't done it before, or like you said, it's part of HR practitioner personnel. So when you do include their voices at the table, like what is their initial reaction or thought, or how?
It's a great question. Well, so because I've already laid the groundwork up front to say, why are we doing it? What are we doing? We may be refreshing the business strategy, and so also need to evolve this strategy as well in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space. Essentially, the interviews, I'm speaking to them one-on-one. So I'm understanding their perspective, where they are in the business. So say they're in sales. We start talking about the business case relative to sales. If they're in R&D, research and development, we think about it that way. If it's finance. So we're thinking about the topic from their lens and perspective. And then the responses are me feeding it back to them collectively as a executive team. And so by this time they're in it. Right? Because they've already invested an hour into the conversation individually, and they're curious to see
what others are saying.
What did everybody else say? And they're not seeing that individually because that's kept confidentially, but they're seeing collectively where did we land, like with any other business strategy. And as a result, then they get to say what's wrong with it, what needs to change, what needs to shift. So by that time, the ownership is there. Right? Now, how it's executed is where I think you're getting into the next step. So not to complicate this, the HR professional or the DEI practitioner still does their job. To me, the HR professional is a process owner. So I look at it as the North Star. So executives determine where we're going, and then you might have a council that determines how we get there. And then you have HR as process owners to say how it gets embedded into our processes. And so I believe everybody plays a role. And the executive team, once they've established the vision, their job is to talk about it and hold people accountable.
And I think that's a big piece. Folks miss the entire accountability piece when it comes to this type of work, but that could be a whole nother podcast.
And it's been coming up in some other conversations. So accountability is huge for change.
Absolutely.
Right? So that's why we call it, it's the case for change. So why should we care? Right? Why should we change? And that individual piece and the organizational piece has to link up. So one of the challenges I see sometimes is with executives, we may have to say, remember they're individuals too. So if you're the practitioner or the HR professional, you may have to understand what each person's why is. And then connect to that why as you build more momentum. And maybe it's that their daughter just recently went into the workforce. And now
all of a sudden
he cares, right? He was a male executive that didn't get women's issues. Now he gets it, right? Because it's hit home. So,
Alrighty. So speaking of the case for change, can organizations have a case for change without a vision of success?
Yeah, they can. Absolutely, they can. However, I don't think you'll make as much progress because you're not being clear around the direction we're going in as an organization and how diversity, equity, and inclusion, or whatever you're rebranding. One of my clients have rebranded it people first, right? So if you have this people first strategy, if you will, how do we know we've achieved it? Is it aspirational? What are the goals? So there's no definition of when we arrive there. Right? What it looks like. And it also doesn't help you understand. Then once you say you assess where you are, well, against what? So you can oftentimes be doing a lot of activity and not having any impact if you haven't articulated the vision.
So now we're going to move on to the role of the leader within DEI. So, who are the key stakeholders and change leaders when it comes to DEI? And we kind of talked about this with the executive level, but is there anyone else within the companies or organizations that you see who are like a key stakeholder or change leader when it comes to this work?
I think So a couple of people, this is an interesting discussion because titles are evolving.
Yep.
People are changing their infrastructure, and organizations are not really clear on how and at what stage they should resource this effort. So I say, if you're embedding this work into the organization, say it's a big part of your sales effort, you may look at it a little different, right? So I would say the key stakeholders start with executives. Of course, human resource professionals, whatever the titles, you know, chief HR officer, HR manager, are huge in that talent lifecycle side. You also have procurement. So supplier diversity.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then, of course, I believe salespeople are huge because they're connecting with our customers. They're the first people you see. Your approach to sell. What if your approach to sell is to get into international markets and not just be, you know, in one location, if you will? Do you have people that can speak the language? That's a big one that I'm hearing. And again, I can speak Spanish and not be, you know, Puerto Rican, for example, or Mexican. So I think it's being really clear on what does it take to speak to your future client and consumer and where you want to expand your market. So those key stakeholders within sales and customer service, I think public relations, communications departments, we need to know how to speak to these different audiences. So those are a few key stakeholders. And then, of course, resource groups. So if you have employee resource groups or business resource groups, those are huge key stakeholders that help people see the culture, an inclusive culture lived. Or, you know, the first people that, you know, say I'm the, you know, a young African-American female hired into an organization, and it could be a lot of people before I see anyone that looks like me. So a resource group can help to ensure that I get onboarded, I feel seen, I feel like I belong, all of those things. So those are a few of the key stakeholders.
I don't know from your experience, but I feel like from my experience, I don't necessarily see a lot of resource groups within organizations.
You don't? Okay.
I don't.
Yeah.
Like, maybe it's because, I mean, my background is education, so I do see it there, but as far as other organizations outside of education, I rarely see like resource groups to support folks who may be underrepresented or, you know, may have some type of let's just say underrepresented. I rarely see them.
Yeah, I think it's really different. I wonder in academia, when you're thinking about it, you're looking for students as your product, for lack of a better term, right? So
I mean, it is a business, no matter how much they try to say it's not.
Right, it is. So you have to kind of, I can see, and I know that most colleges and universities, for example, they'll say, you want to start a club, right? I think some corporations, depending on the corporation, they have to think about like, okay, well, is this, how do we connect this? Is it union? I mean, you know, there's a lot of different legal concerns if it's a very conservative company. And then there's also concern about it getting out of hand. Like, okay, how many resource groups do, right? Who's managing it when you have your so-called DEI people first office with one person, right? But I do think that if you see them evolving from helping the culture, right, to helping the business, it may change if you need them. And I think it's a question that all organizations just have to ask. Do we want them? Do we need them? What are their value? But I've worked in organizations where we launched them when I was in consumer packaged goods, and we also made them think tanks. So the research and development came to the resource groups and said, oh, great, we can use this as a test group before we go into this market. And also we can cut that by that demographic. So for some organizations, they're looking for, do we have enough critical mass, right? So I want to start these groups, but do we have enough people in this group? So what you'll see is multicultural, and there's, you know, good and bad. So I think we can do that as a separate conversation because there's positives to having them multicultural, but you have to give space for them to grow into you know, African-American, Indian. And then even with that, we have to account for the diversity within the diversity. right? So we
That
can't assume that.
intersectionality piece, yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah,
Within the Indian or Asian population alone, the only thing that unites that group is possibly the fact that they speak English as a second language. Not the food, not the dress, not the, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Not the country. So it's something to really consider and make sure you understand your key stakeholders and your constituents and what they need. And there's a bit of, with resource groups, a push and a pull. Right, we want to have them, but we want them employee-led.
Right.
Employee resource groups are employee-led groups. So.
Great conversation. So how do you deal with organizational cultures that think DEI is just the job of HR?
Oh, yes. So how much time do we have, Dr. B? Yeah, this is huge. I will say in the beginning of the journey, many organizations will all feel as practitioners that all of this work is on us. You know, and in the beginning, a lot of it might be, and the few folks or advocates or champions that we've identified. But if you're in, I would say, your second stage of the journey, you need to intentionally begin to evolve this to someone else. So what does that look like? One example is a council. Right. So, and again, if that doesn't work for you, you already have different structures in place, then maybe it's impact teams. One of my clients calls them impact teams, or inclusion councils versus diversity councils. Right. So whatever you call them, you do need an infrastructure to ensure this is sustainable. Measure success. What gets measured gets done. And then you can put people in place where it makes sense. So let's say my business case for this topic is all about talent. Then I want to be sure that I've engaged the vice president of talent, the department that hires the most people. Hello. And so I now have a dog in that fight. I now have a reason to make this important in my organization, because I am looking at and needing the talent from all backgrounds, right? You might also look at your sales strategy as a way to engage. And I guess it could be overwhelming to think that every leader is going to jump on the bandwagon. So what I would say is look at your business strategy or your organizational strategy and say, who is the most influential or the most important key stakeholder, and then bring them to the table. Would you? I hear you saying is always go back to the business case. Yes. If things are not aligning with that, then there might need to be some strategizing and refining to make sure that things align with your business case, but then also knowing who your intentional key stakeholders are who can help drive along that business case. And I would say for practitioners, you may need to get off of that if it's not part of the business. I cannot even tell you how many HR professionals don't really know the business. So if we're in this to, kind of sing kumbaya, we may be, shooting ourselves in the foot. Right. So when I first got into this work, I always said, I want to be a voice for the voiceless. That was my mantra. That was my brand. That was back in the day, right? That was before you hit the ground running and doing all the work. And that was what I needed to do and what I wanted to do. But over time, I was spending too much time in the choir. And so I wasn't helping underrepresented groups, staying with them. I needed to be coaching those that could open doors for them. And so similarly, I would say the HR, whoever is leading this work, needs to think about, like, are you doing this for you? Or is this a self-agenda driven topic? Are you almost like the resource groups, right? You can be multicultural, but if all you're doing is for African Americans, we need to look at it. So, what's your mission? What's your objective? And so part of the reason why we can't bring others along or can't get other buy-in is because we may be looking at this too focused. Narrow. It's too narrow. Agree. What advice would you give to change leaders still trying to articulate or confirm the value of the business case for DEI? Great example. So a great question. I would say to talk to other business leaders, to test it. And I would say you don't have to be perfect, right? We have this concept called the minimum value product. Minimum, so you don't have to have perfection, but you do need to pressure test what it looks like, what it sounds like here. So I talked about a process of talking to a bunch of executives, right? You may need to have conversations one-on-one with those key stakeholders and pressure test the business case. You may need to say, hey, is this still relevant given our current times? Is this still relevant given our current business strategy or our current mission or what the board is saying? And then I think what I see is sometimes practitioners staying away from leaders because they ask the hard questions. But I would say
the
they're
leaders
helping
ask
you.
the hard questions.
They are asking the hard
yeah.
questions, and they're not prepared to answering. And so I don't think you're really ready, right? If you aren't bringing them to the table.
Yeah.
And you're not ready to answer those questions because they're helping you before it gets to the rest of the organization.
Right.
What that leader who you trust is asking is actually
They're asking
helping you.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
They'll help you get more buy-in in the organization. So I would say bring them to the table, engage the naysayers. If you got a naysayer that's also an influencer, even better, right? Yeah. Like they're always listening to Jim, then talk to Jim. So pick up,
Jim.
Yeah, right?
I haven't tapped on you in a while.
That's right.
I do need your expertise for this. So come on into it.
Right. And it could be something as simple as, hey, I'm looking at our evolution. I really value your opinion. Could you just take a listen to this and tell me what's missing?
You think? Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And again, you're engaging folks who, I think we had this conversation a little earlier, but engaging the employees or getting your employees' thought versus, starting from the top.